Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Carefulist, the podcast. I'm Katie Christophic, founder of The Carefulist. Today, we have Justin Lee Pierce with us. He is founder and managing partner of Everstead Capital. How are you, Justin?
I'm doing well, Katie. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for joining us. So,
Absolutely.
I want to get right into who you are and your background, if you would love to share a little bit about that.
Absolutely. Well, first and foremost, I appreciate you having me on. I know I've shared with you my extended podcast experience. So I'm just really thrilled to be here, and it's a pleasure, truly. So thank you. Yeah, so as Katie mentioned, my name is Justin Pierce. I work with Everstead Capital, and I'm involved in a variety of things. So, love sports, love basketball, football, ran track in high school. It's probably the one thing that I reminisce the most about. I know all of my friends and my kids certainly are tired of hearing stories of glory. Um, but that's another episode. That's another episode. I've been working in the financial realm since on and off since 2006, but really, involved since 2014. And my career has sort of just evolved. Started out just in the sphere of insurance, mostly life insurance and some ancillary products, and then slowly graduated more towards the holistic approach of finance. And that's
Okay,
uh, that's where we are today.
great. And when we were talking a little bit before, you had mentioned that you do have some caregiving experience in your family. Would you care to share a little bit about that with us?
Absolutely. So going way, way back, I actually worked in healthcare in a different life. There was a period of time I thought I might be a nurse.
Mhm,
I worked with people with mental disabilities and
mhm,
limitations, and then sort of uh, that kind of came from dealing with that firsthand as a grandchild, somebody who needed care when I was young. My
mhm,
grandmother came to live with us. That was a very emotional period. I didn't know I didn't see it then like I see it today.
mhm.
I probably enabled some of the difficulty because my grandmother loved her sugar, and I have her to thank for my love of Reese's peanut butter cups. And I tell this story when I talk about it because I remember the toll it took on my mom. Every time I stuffed my
Yeah.
grandmother a piece of candy, my mom would have to give her a shot, and
Mm,
that was it was really trying on my mom watching my grandmother sort of wither from this very
mm.
strong woman that my mother had known, and my grandmother that I had known. And it was just a very emotionally draining process, to
Yeah.
kind of watch it unfold. And then she ended up doing the same thing for her father, but having to fly to Nevada and live there for several months until he ultimately
Oh,
lots
wow.
of first yeah lots of firsthand experience with that.
Mhm.
It's not easy for a family. More than the financial is the emotional strain that I think it.
Yeah. Well, and I think that foundation is so interesting based on the trajectory that your financial career has eventually taken, which we'll get into in a bit. Um, so actually, you know what? We can get into it now. Your team does obviously all kinds of financial planning and insurance and things like that. But one of the things that your team does that a lot of financial planners don't do is talk about and offer long-term care. So, can you talk about the financial aspects of long-term care and the importance of planning for that?
Absolutely. Well, I'll kind of back up a little bit.
Sure.
Part of what qualifies me to kind of talk about this beyond the experience itself is that because I saw the need, I saw this gap that existed
Mhm.
in our industry. It led me to go and get my CLTC, which is a certified long-term care professional designation. And
Mhm.
it really talks to the importance of planning for these things. I think the difficulty when we're talking about ourselves planning is we have to realize our own mortality, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's very difficult for people as they transition, especially when they're looking to retirement. If
Hmm.
they've not experienced something like this firsthand, um, it's it's very difficult to accept that there's a possibility that they become fragile or feeble in their old age. And I think it's much easier for all of us to kind of take that stance that, well, it's not going to happen to me, right?
Right.
And we throw all the statistics out, sort of come full circle and start, to really answer your question. 70% of those individuals 65 and older will need some form of long-term care.
Yeah.
um, and I think importantly too, Katie, is understanding that long-term care is on a spectrum, right?
Hmm.
I believe that a lot of people have this misconception that, oh my gosh, I don't want to go to a home and see my
Hmm.
golden ages out there, right? Well, that might not necessarily be the case. And that's what we have found in our experience through our practice and sitting with clients is, maybe mom gets around really, really well, but she sometimes forgets to take important medication, right?
Hmm.
So we need to plan to have somebody go and make sure that mom takes care of her medication so that she doesn't worsen in her state. Right?
Yeah.
So, long-term care is something that gets left out a lot of times because I think I read recently 50% of advisors
Hmm.
never take into consideration the future costs. So it can be extremely detrimental to a portfolio when you've saved your entire life if you have for it.
Yeah. Absolutely. Um, oof. So what you said was so important, and the wheels are turning now. So there is a really big spectrum of care, right? Like you said, it could be as quote unquote simple as someone coming to remind a person to take their medication and to make sure that those smaller tasks are being handled. And then it can evolve, as that person ages or as their disease progresses, that they might need some more care several years down the line. So it's certainly a spectrum, and then it also can be progressive spectrum.
Sure.
So it may
Absolutely.
be a smaller spend up front, but you may need more dollars down the line.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's the difficulty in it is, we all know that old adage, we don't plan to fail, we just fail to plan. Right.
Yeah.
I can give you a great example. There's a young lady we sat with a couple of weeks ago, client of ours down in Maryland. Her mother is capable, in terms of getting around. She still lives at home, but she requires some assistance, right? To do
Hmm.
the daily things, to fold her laundry and clean clothes and dishes and cook for her. That's a scenario where she's on the lower end of the spectrum in terms of need, but the
Hmm.
cost because she wants to stay at home is extremely high. It's around $20,000 a month. So,
Oh.
yeah, it's extreme, and the national average for any sort of care is about $9,000, give or take, per
Hmm.
month. So when you start talking about $20,000 a month, if you look at someone's portfolio, when we're talking about retirement, you
Hmm.
know, let's assume they're by themselves. Can they sustain $20,000 a month coming out of their investments? And more importantly, what if they're married? Can
Hmm.
the community spouse, the individual that's at home or not requiring the care, what does that mean for their quality of life? And that's really what we aim to mitigate and plan for when we're assisting.
Yeah. Yeah. And you said something earlier that I was just thinking about, which is when someone is thinking about retiring and they want to, it's something they've been dreaming about, right? They've put off the travel, they've put off going here and doing this so that they can do it during retirement. And nobody wants to think about the fact that maybe retirement won't look like that. And that
Sure.
is a really hard thing to wrap your brain around when you've worked so long to have that time. And that really resonated with me because essentially that happened to my parents.
Mhm.
My dad worked and he was a teacher for a very long time. He retired after 35 to 40-ish years of teaching. He did it for a long time. Then he had a second career
Wow.
after that. So when he fully retired, they were, in their mid to late 60s. And my mom already was exhibiting symptoms of dementia. So
Mm.
they had a very limited window to do the things that they wanted to do in retirement. So from a financial perspective, that's one thing, but for our listeners as well, one of the lessons that I've taken from that, my husband and I talk about this, is we don't want to put off to retirement the things that we really want to do because we've seen how things can happen. And while my mom couldn't physically go anywhere, so she had the disease, my dad was perfectly healthy, but because he was taking care of her, he couldn't go either. Right.
Right.
So, like, there was nothing wrong with him, but tangentially, he was homebound.
Yeah. I think that's the most difficult thing to accept. I mean,
Yeah.
if we all have children and we think about it, like, gosh, I don't want to be a burden to my
Right.
children. And I think when you flip the mindset of, well, it's not going to happen to me, to what if it does, and what does that mean for those around me? I
Yep.
think you're more inclined to plan.
Hmm.
Because again, the worst case scenario is you plan for it and you don't need it, right? Versus the flip side of
Yeah.
that coin is you don't plan for it and you do need it. Now what
Hmm.
does that do as far as impact those around you, that whose quality of life will be called into question now because of your lack of planning, unfortunately.
Right. And I was talking with someone recently, so I would love to hear your take on this. Um, People often talk about, well, I pay into insurance, and if I don't need it, then I'm just throwing my money away. But there are long-term care insurance options where you do get some money back, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm a big analogy person. I think it levels the playing field, makes things very easy to understand. So when I talk about insurance, I think first it helps to say it a couple times. Right? It's insurance. It's just in case. And I love to use health insurance mostly because I'm still pretty reckless. I still play a lot of sports. My kids are still involved in stuff. We're always doing silly things. And I say, listen, we pay those insurance premiums month in and month out throughout the entire year.
Hmm.
Best case scenario, we don't have to go to the doctor. I'm not going to go kick a tree and then play in traffic so that I can feel like my premiums were justified. Right.
Right.
So I think that's first and foremost. It is just in case.
Mhm.
To your point, we've made a lot of progress when it comes to long-term care. I mean, the way that we're qualifying people for long-term care has changed. Not to get too into the weeds, but the traditional long-term care stuff can be really difficult to qualify for, right? So that's
Mhm.
been a turnoff for a number of years for a lot of folks because, maybe they have arthritis or they've had a knee replacement. Long-term care insurance wasn't even on their radar because they don't
Mhm.
qualify, they can't get it. And then to your point is the idea that they're waiting until longer to even apply because the thought of paying these premiums for 15, 20, 30 years and then peacefully passing in their sleep and there's
Mhm.
nothing that comes of those dollars is terrifying, right?
Yeah.
So what we've been able to do is implement some hybrid strategies. And there's a variety of
Okay.
them. Some of them come in the form of life insurance. So
Mhm.
you can purchase forms of life insurance that have what we call living benefits attached to them. One of those being chronic illness.
Hmm.
So in the event that something happens to you and you get a letter from one doctor stating you can't complete two of the activities of daily living, we call it turning a faucet on, where you can
Mhm.
start to use the life insurance company's money. In my example, a lot of what we do, 25%, up to 96% of the overall policy, but 25% per year, that you can start to use to supplement your long-term care need. And then the other side of that are some other insurance-based vehicles like annuities, right? So you would
Mhm.
put money into this annuity, the annuity says, hey, Katie, based on the premium that you put in here, this is the amount of income we're going to give you. But in the event, again, you have some sort of qualifying event, usually involves two of those activities, daily living, we're going to double your income for a period of time to help you pay for the long-term care necessity that has befallen.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's really interesting. Thank you for
Yep.
explaining that. And
Yeah,
just
absolutely.
for our listeners who aren't entirely sure, can you explain annuity?
Yeah. So an annuity, for the older folks, your Social Security is an annuity, basically.
Mhm.
For everyone else, I like to use the lottery as an example. So you have this chunk of money. Let's say you've grown your nest egg to $1 million, and you say, Justin, I'd like this $1 million to pay out an income. I would look at a potential annuity where I would take this money, I would put it somewhere. It would be now there's all different flavors, right? We liken them to sundaes. You can add sprinkles, you can keep them vanilla, add flavors, what have you. But essentially, what it's going to do then is the insurance company is going to take that money and they're going to guarantee you an income for the rest of your life. Or if you're
Mm,
married and you choose a dual life outcome or income, they will pay both of you a guaranteed income until both of you pass away. And then
okay.
in a lot of instances, as long as it's structured appropriately, depending on the benefits that you pick, whatever's left in there, if there's money left at the time of your passing, that is your death benefit and can be left behind to loved
Wow. Oh, that's really good to know. Thank you for explaining
ones.
that.
Yeah, of
I had a
course.
general idea, but I know I'm not the only one who is um, not completely up to snuff on financial literacy aspect of things. And we could
No,
go down
yeah.
that rabbit hole as to why that would have been a really great class for us to have in high school.
Oh, I know. Well, and I think too, the last thing I'll touch on annuities is just like the long-term care, they've come a long way.
Mm,
We've come across plenty of folks, the old annuities used to be you give your money to the insurance company, you would annuitize, so you turn your income on, and that meant you were giving that money up. So when
mhm,
you would pass away, if there was any money left, the insurance company would keep it.
mm,
That is not how they work today.
okay.
So similar to the long-term care, if there's money left over and you pass away, that becomes a death benefit. It's not a use it or lose it.
Mhm.
And like I said, you can add all sorts of, different flavors and sprinkles and different things and structure them, to fit your specific scenario. So they've come a long way, but we definitely could have used financial literacy courses in school for sure.
So that leads me to a question, which I think will lead into another question. It's just sort of how my brain works. So, um, you mentioned the death benefit side of things. Is that something that is taxed, and do loved ones need to be prepared for that? And so where this is going, and I think your answer will probably lead to it anyway, is estate planning and trusts and things like that. So how does all of that tie together?
Yeah, so great question. So I do want to preface this. I'm not an attorney and I'm not a CPA. However, we do work very closely in connecting those dots and making sure people understand things at a high level. So, death benefits related to life insurance are always 100% tax free. So the idea is you must take the death benefit, and this is an important caveat. You must take the death benefit in a lump sum. So let's say, for example, you had a life insurance policy pay out to you, and then you said, "Hey, I want to take that money and I want to put it over here into this annuity." And
Hmm.
then there were gains on that death benefit. So I received $100,000 from my mom's life insurance. I put it over here in this annuity. The insurance company is going to invest that, for lack of a better phrase, on my behalf, and then it's going to grow. Now it becomes taxable to a degree. I'm going to pay capital gains on the dollars that have grown above and beyond what I put in.
Oh, that
But
makes
on the
sense.
$100,000 I receive, if I just take that money and receive it, it's completely tax free, which is why life insurance is such an important aspect of your overall retirement game plan.
Mhm.
Because back to the idea of kicking the tree, right? It's insurance.
And there's all different types of insurance. But I think if we're talking about younger folks, right, they've not reached a point where they are self-insured, where they have a large sum of money somewhere. So the
Hmm.
insurance kind of steps in that gap and makes sure
Yeah.
that their family's taken care of, the debt's paid down, the income is replaced to some degree. With older folks, it can be absolutely more of a, I want to make sure final expenses are paid. I want to make sure that whatever I've saved and haven't spent in retirement actually gets left behind to my loved ones.
Hmm.
So you could, in essence, get a life insurance policy and rely on that to be um, the largest part of your inheritance and what you leave behind. Does that answer your question as far as the life insurance goes, death benefit being taxed and
Yes.
whatnot?
Yeah, that's
Very good.
great. Thank you. Okay, so one of the other questions that I was thinking about, and I got to thinking about it because I was checking out your social posts online. So if you're not following Everstead Capital, you should. But
And I
one of
like
the
the plug.
things,
Thank you.
you're welcome. But one of the things that I found really interesting was something I had never heard of before, which is called the second to die life insurance policy. Can you share for our audience what that is?
Sure. So a second to die policy, it just simply means the insurance death benefit will not be paid out until both parties have passed away. So the most common second to die policy you'll see will be with a husband and wife, right?
Mhm.
And there's a number of reasons why you would do that and benefits to doing so. One of which is the premiums, the cost for the insurance are typically significantly less because they're
Mhm.
insuring two lives for the same dollars.
Mhm.
And so, if you had your father pass away, the mother would continue paying the premiums until she passes away, and then the death benefit would be paid out to the heirs.
Okay. And is that only applicable to folks who are married? Do you have to be married to be able to have that?
No, not necessarily. So
Okay.
the rules say that there must be what's called insurable interest. So there has to be a reason why the individual would want to get a life insurance policy on you. And, in most cases going to be a child and their parent. Um, it can be any sort of family members or business owners who are partners.
Mm,
The second to die just makes a lot more sense for the husband and wife.
yeah. Okay. Great. Well, thank you for explaining that because
Of
until I
course.
saw that post, I had never heard of that. And I thought, oh, if I haven't heard of it, other people haven't either. Um,
Yeah, it's a really interesting strategy because a lot of times what it does is it makes sure that once the parties have passed away, it can be what handles and settles the estate. That way,
mhm,
there's not some sort of fire sale. You don't have to. It
right.
keeps the estate liquid so that you don't have to sell cars and houses and things like that. It'd be a
Mm,
challenge. Yep.
yeah. Yeah. And I have seen people post sort of nightmare scenarios about having to do those types of things and they don't even have the opportunity to grieve because they're so mired in paperwork and finances and trying to figure that out.
Yeah, no, that's part of what makes life insurance so important because I'll ask couples and say, "Do you like each other?" And they say, "Well, yeah." And I say, "Well, okay, so if Tony passed away tomorrow, and
Mhm.
let's say today's Thursday, right? Tony passes away on Friday. Are you going back to work on Monday?" Well, no, probably not. I'm not going to be ready to do that. Well, why? Well, I need to grieve. I need to accept learn to accept and absorb what's happened. Well, that's
Mhm.
why the life insurance is there because it can replace that income and give you a runway and it
Yeah.
allows you to properly grieve so that you're not being forced to jump back into work and, risking your mental health,
Mhm.
because again, you failed to plan. So that's why the life is so important.
So while we're on this topic of things that I've seen on your social channels, something else that you posted that I thought was a really good thing to think about. And it was that 1 in 3 grandparents are living with grandchildren under the age of 18, and they're taking on parental responsibilities, which kind of leads to also financial responsibilities. So
Yeah.
How is this impacting retirement planning? How are you seeing it impact retirement savings and all of that?
Yeah. Well, I think so, kind of to tie everything together, what I'll start saying is retirement planning starts with conversation, right?
Mhm.
It starts with a husband and a wife or spouses, what have you, determining what that retirement looks like with one
Mhm.
another. I can't tell you the number of times, one person says, "Hey, I'm going to go fishing and camping every day." The other one says, "No, no, like we're going to go stay with the grandkids all the time."
Mhm.
So getting your mind wrapped around what retirement is going to look like is number one, because if you have a mindset, we all know what we're retiring from. The
Mhm.
question becomes, what are we retiring to? So
Yes.
if we know first and foremost what we're retiring to, guess what? We can plan for it, right?
Mhm.
So when we talk about what it's doing to impact retirement planning, I think we have to look at both sides, right? We have to look
Yeah.
at the grandparents that are living with the grandchildren and taking on that parental responsibility. How does it impact their retirement?
Mhm.
Um, because I have a client, for example, he's fully retired. He can't spend his social security. He lives with his daughter. He takes care of the kids. But he really has very little financial responsibility in that home. He's sort of staying in a guest house. That
Mhm.
looks a lot different, right? But
Yeah.
then we compare that to the child. What does that mean for their retirement planning? Because if they're
Mhm.
taking on a majority of additional, um, any sort of financial requirements there, that can impact their ability to save. So I
Yeah.
think communication becomes a really big one.
Right.
And it's pretty straightforward. If you've got one person who has to spend more dollars, that changes what they can save. And if you have another person who is not necessarily taking on financial burden of the children, that looks different.
Mhm.
When we start talking about grandparents who are taking on that financial burden, obviously, I think if they hadn't planned for it, that's another period of time. Let's call it, 14, 15 years, depending on how long they're staying with their children and taking care of the grandchildren, that they're now spending down their assets at a much
Mhm.
more rapid pace. Um,
Yeah.
you know, I have an adult daughter. I now go and I have dinner with her every now and again, but that looks a lot different than if I'm taking her out to eat every single day. And
Right.
so I think it's something that has to be communicated and in best case scenario planned for. Of course, we all know life happens, but it
Yep.
it absolutely it impacts retirement. On the other side of that, though, I will say, Katie, I think having there's tons of studies that point to the idea that so many people pass away early in retirement because they lack purpose.
Mm.
So moving in and taking care of those children, while it can be, there's some cortisol involved there, some stress.
Yeah.
There's actually the idea of a rediscovered new purpose of,
Right.
still feeling needed and important and taking care of
Mhm.
their grandchildren and the joy that comes.
Right. And the routine. Humans are creatures of
Absolutely.
habit, and having a routine and a schedule is really important. Of
Yeah,
course, in addition
absolutely.
to all of that connection and, you know, kids' giggles and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a great point. That's a great point. Absolutely.
Something you said, I really, really appreciate and got me thinking about the last post of yours I'm going to talk about. I'm not stalking your account. I just found
That's
some
okay
really
if you are.
interesting
It's good.
information on there.
That's good.
Um,
That's good. I like it.
one of and I had no idea. And so this is what I really want to talk about this. So I'll preface it with the idea of the sandwich generation. We're starting to hear more and more about that, and how the definition previously was, the assumption of a woman who's maybe in her 50s taking care of elderly parents and if she has children, they are high school, maybe college age. The sandwich generation thing is shifting, and it's shifting younger because of a lot of different reasons. One of them is that people are having children later in life. So, they may be in their 60s or 70s, but their child is still in their 30s or maybe their early 40s. And so if they had kids younger, you know, Okay, so maybe they still have kids who are at home, or if they had kids on that same timeline, now they're taking care of aging parents and they may have preschoolers or elementary age kids at home. And so then everybody has more needs, right? So you don't have a
Yeah.
self-sufficient part of the sandwich, everybody needs you. And I think more and more millennials who, I think people still think millennials are very young folks. But the fact of the matter is, millennials are now in their early 40s to, I think the last of them are turning 30 this year or next year. Um, so, which I'm not calling y'all old. That's not true, but you're not teenagers, right? Millennials are not
State of mind.
teenagers.
It's a
They
state of
are
mind, Katie. State of mind.
fully functional adults. But the whole point of this is that 3 out of 5 millennials don't own any stock,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is un not unbelievable because I am a Gen X by the skin of my teeth, and my husband listens to every podcast. So I have to be fair. I missed being a millennial by 6 days. Legit, was born the end of 1980. So, I tout that I'm Gen X, but I'll hear about it later. So,
I don't know. That's a bad thing because I know our generation. I'm a millennial, smack dab in the center of it, and I've been beaten up quite a bit for being a millennial. So I don't know that it's the worst thing in the world that you escaped our generation. But I will say I'm sorry to hear that because I do like being a millennial. So
well,
that's
and
okay.
I
I
I
take the
mean,
beating.
I obviously grew up with and very much understand the millennial experience. And so
Sure.
because of all of the different challenges millennials specifically have faced with the 2008 economic downturn and the housing crisis as everybody's coming out of college and trying to get their first jobs, through other economic challenges and of course the pandemic and all of that. um, I shouldn't be surprised that 3 out of 5 don't own stock, but it's such a high number.
Yeah.
And because that age group is moving further into, full on adulthood, what does that mean for them? Can they play catch up? Because, a fair number of my listeners are, in that millennial, younger Gen X category.
I think you make some really great points. The millennials have gone through a wide range of emotions and fiscal calamities, just a lot of situations to have to try to overcome. I
Mhm.
know when I started in the industry, ME is short for millennial, but it also means we are the me generation. And what I mean by that is, we're one of the first generations where you're looking ahead and you're thinking Social Security probably isn't going to be one of my primary sources of income.
Yep.
Neither will pensions. The days
Oh,
of,
they don't
outside
exist,
of
do they? Still?
yeah, I mean, teachers and, some public sector jobs, but aside
Mhm.
from that, the days of getting a watch, a 30, 40-year pin and a
Yeah.
pension are kind of by the wayside. So, we've had to learn there's been this transition from what we call the defined benefit plan, the pension, where
Mhm.
they said, this is the guaranteed amount you're going to get every year, to a defined contribution where now we're saying, okay, we get to define what we want to contribute on our own behalf to our retirement. And oh,
Mhm.
by the way, nobody taught us how to invest in high school or even college in some instances. And now you're telling me I'm in charge of picking what makes sense so that I can try to save enough money for retirement. So it's definitely been a challenge and one that I think is growing increasingly visible as our generation gets a little bit older. To kind of pivot and answer your question about catching up, I do think it's possible. I know it sounds biased. It's probably not the answer that a lot of people want to hear.
Mhm.
Um, with with more and more jobs offering 401ks with matches, I think people need to the best of their ability, try to take advantage of maximizing those free dollars. Because
Yeah.
when you look at it, let's say you have a 6% match. I mean, if you put 6% in, that is essentially 100% rate of return. And
Hmm.
I'm a really good advisor, but I can't beat that. I can't outdo 100%. And then there's the idea of just, again, it's a rabbit hole, but kind of taking a look at what you think taxes are going to do in the future and determining, hey, do I want to contribute pre-tax and have to face paying the taxes at a later date on the harvest? Or do I like
Hmm.
the idea of paying the taxes on the seed and understanding that Uncle Sam, can't come and take anything from me in the future? So it's going to require some creativity for millennials.
Yeah.
I truly feel that. And a willingness to learn and a willingness to contribute and maybe sacrifice more um, currently than what we might want.
Yeah.
I I do think the other side of that, Katie, too, is something that doesn't get talked a lot about outside of our industry. And I want to preface this by saying, under no circumstances am I advocating for, elitism or entitlement. But there
Hmm.
is something called the wall of wealth, and there's trillions, upwards of $65 trillion that is expected to be passed down from the baby boomer generation down to X and down the millennial. Again, not something I necessarily want to you know tell you to rely upon, but I
Hmm.
think that's going to change a lot of futures. And
Mm.
how that money is passed is just as important. And that's kind of another rabbit hole to go down in terms of overall financial planning, because when you leave money behind, what that means from a tax standpoint and, to
Hmm.
those loved ones you're leaving that money behind to, what it means to their overall financial.
Yeah. Oh, so that's a very interesting thought because I'm wondering how many people know what their parents' financial situation is and, where that paperwork is and what the policies are and all of that. So, do you have any suggestions about how to go about finding out? We talked a little bit earlier about having open conversations and communication.
Yeah.
Um, but from a financial planning perspective, do you facilitate conversations like that or how, and if no, that's okay. I'm just not sure how that
Yeah.
typically works.
No, certainly. So I think communication, everything stems from communication, right? And I
Hmm.
understand you have to maintain a certain level of sensitivity when we're talking to our parents who are aging.
Hmm.
Hey, you don't go in guns a blazing and saying, hey, if you kick the bucket, where do I find everything? Um, but I think framing that conversation and saying, sitting down with mom and dad and saying, hey, listen, um, I'm not sure entirely what it was like going through grandma and grandpa's stuff.
Hmm.
And I could speak to my personal experience. It was a mess,
Yeah.
as it is for a lot of people. And I think again, similar to the long-term care element, if you dealt with it, you're more sensitive and more open to the idea of that all taking
Hmm.
place. But I think you frame it and you say, hey, listen, what happens if something happens to one of you? Because more and more we see, especially with like even younger folks now, we're seeing one person of a married couple is the one who does all the finances, right?
Hmm.
Um, the other couple, the other part of the couple, in some instances, can't even tell you what the mortgage is. They couldn't tell
Yeah.
you, you know what I mean? They don't know that that's not what they're dealing with. So I think framing the conversation and saying, hey, listen, if something happened to mom, dad, would you be able to kind of stand in the gap, keep paying everything, keep everything afloat without any sort of hitches? And if the answer is no, then we need to unpack that a little. And then
Right.
ultimately having conversations about what do you want to have happen, you know,
Hmm.
when it's your time, right?
Yeah.
And making sure those advanced directives are in place, making sure, if there's one piece of advice I could give everybody, it's check your beneficiaries.
Mm.
That's a huge one. It helps avoid probate, which is a really ugly, drawn out, long procedure. And I think starting there, that's a lot less of a invasive question. Is, hey, are
Hmm.
your beneficiaries updated, mom and dad? And do you
Yeah.
have powers of attorney? have you decided what you want to have happen if something happens to one of you, you get into an accident or something like that? And have you named somebody to speak on your behalf? And
Hmm.
first and foremost, do you have a will? Do you have a
Yeah.
will? Do you have a trust? Is there some sort of direction? And who's going to be the one to see that through? And then
Hmm.
it's just about the logistics of it. I always maintain, for our clients, I want them to have a binder. We want to look at what their balances are in all their accounts, make sure those numbers are up to date, make sure the beneficiaries are up to date, keep that binder somewhere safe where it has all the
Hmm.
important documentation, the statements, any sort of logins if they're there. You
Hmm.
might, there's a story in the news several years ago where a gentleman passed away unexpectedly. I think he was in his 30s, and he had hundreds of millions of dollars in crypto, and his wife couldn't access it because he never told anybody to log in. So, that's a modern day
Yeah.
example of not knowing where mom and dad's will is,
Hmm.
or not knowing where the statements are. So having all that stuff in a place, and then protecting it in a fire safer, and then having points of contact. Hey, listen, if something happens to me, this is who you call. I think that goes a long
Right.
way, and that's really important. And you don't necessarily have to know you can start there without having to know the specifics of, well, how much am I getting, or how much do you have, mom
Hmm.
and dad? It's
Yep.
more important to know where those things live.
Right. So as you were saying that, two tools came to mind just for the audience's benefit. If you have listened to one of the previous podcasts, you heard Lisa Paul, who is the founder and creator of the Death Deck. And so it's a card game essentially that has all kinds of questions on it to help facilitate conversation. And some of those questions, most of them are geared toward what do you want for end of life and things like that. But some of them have financial questions, that kind of thing. The other thought that I had is as you're talking about organizing um, the paperwork and all of that is a product called the Knock Box, the next of kin, NOK box. And it's a fire safe box and it prompts you to fill the box. And it has different things in it that say you need to gather your financial information and your passwords and all of that. So that could be a conversation starter. If you want to
Absolutely.
purchase that or even just say, hey, I saw an ad for it because I see ads for it all the time, but my algorithm, I'm sure, is different than most people because I'm in the caregiving stuff all the time.
Sure.
Um, but it's a good segue to that conversation of, hey, I saw this. This is really good for organization. Do you have something? I'd be happy to get it for you. Let's talk about where you have things.
I
Um,
love that.
yeah. Yeah. So, and those are not paid advertisements or anything like that. It's just what I've found to be helpful. So, full
Yeah, no, I
disclosure.
love that. I love it. I love it. Anything you can get to start the conversation and get the ball rolling on those things, because again, you know, we understand these conversations are tough. Nobody wants to think about what's going
Right.
to happen at the end, or if I get sick. But again, you want to make sure you're planning, and you want to make sure you put those around you in the best possible position going forward.
Yeah, exactly. So, you mentioned that the thing that you would love everybody to do is check and make sure that their benefits are up to date. So, I think that's a great piece of advice because it's simple, it's actionable, everybody can do that. Is there anything else that folks should be thinking about in terms of their financial well-being that they could do today or a small step in the next couple of weeks?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll come back to it. The idea of having beneficiaries in place,
Mhm.
for anybody. If you have any sort of financial accounts, go to your credit union, go to your bank, ask for something called a transfer on death or a payable on death form. That is so that
Okay.
you can name a beneficiary on those accounts. I would absolutely do that today. If you're working, I would say step one is just learn a little bit about your 401k plan or whatever your retirement plan is. See if they offer one, see what your options are as far as the match, whether or not they allow you to contribute Roth dollars, so after tax dollars, and just sort of, envelop yourself a little bit in understanding how the plan works at a high level. And then the
Mhm.
next step would just be, ask for help, right? Reach out to a financial professional to get some advice on, what makes sense for you to do, and kind of start the dialogue of understanding your thoughts on, what taxes are going to do, what you might want it to look like. If you're on the younger end of the spectrum, if you're on the older end of the spectrum, I would say take some steps to make sure that you do have a will, that you do have a durable power of attorney, and have any sort of advanced directives, protocoled somewhere. Because again,
Mhm.
that's something, if we're married, we always think, well, I'm going to name my spouse my power of attorney. Well, if you're anything like my wife and me, we go everywhere together. So,
Yeah,
the downside to that is if we're in an ugly car accident, chances are if one of us goes, the other one's going too. And what does that mean to our
right.
heirs? You know,
Yeah.
or in the event that, my wife is my power of attorney and, she predeceases me and,
Hmm.
I haven't updated that. Now I'm in the same accident. Who can make those decisions on my behalf? So I'd say
Right.
those are really, some of the key elements to beginning the
Hmm.
steps of creating a financial plan is making sure you have those things in place. And then life insurance. I think life insurance, if you're young, it's super cheap. It's free to get a quote. So many
Hmm.
places you can obtain one, whether it's through somebody like myself, a financial professional, but just getting some sort of quote and understanding, what your risks are and what we're trying to protect you from,
Hmm.
and making sure you're looking into that.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for joining us today, Justin. For the folks who are listening at home, he is with Everstead Capital. They have offices in South Central Pennsylvania and Towson, Maryland. Um, One quick question as we lead out, Justin, are you available online for folks who live outside of that area?
Yes. Yep. So we have a
Okay.
website. You can find us on eversteadcap.com. And then I'm on all of the major socials. So J. Lee Pierce are my personal handles. You can find me there. You can also email me anytime at my first name, Justin, at Everstead Cap.
Fantastic. And we will put all of those links in the additional information for the show. So thanks so much for joining us today, Justin. And for
Absolutely.
those of you
My
at home,
pleasure.
take care.